So welcome everybody to another edition of the MedTech20. Today's guest is a fellow named Cam Hunjan. Cam was one of the SVPs and managing director of a business called Movianto, which is a 3PL logistics healthcare supplier who was recently divested from the parent company Owens and Minor and sold to a business called Walden in France. So an interesting time for Cam to be leading that business, signing a new contract with the NHS during the time of COVID to deliver PPE and various other assets and equipment to the various hospitals, both in the UK and right across Europe as well, and all against the backdrop of the company being up for sale. So a really fascinating conversation with Cam. One other thing that's worth noting at the end of the conversation, you'll hear Cam describe what he's looking for next through the sale of the Movianto business and the transfer of the ownership to a company in France means Cam is now actively on the market. So I'm sure he'd love to hear from you if you have an interesting opportunity to discuss with him. And on that note, let's get into this conversation. So Cam, welcome to the MedTech20. Really excited to have this conversation with you. You've got some really kind of unique experience, particularly in the time of COVID, and so really looking forward to have this discussion with you. But I think you were actually the last person that I had lunch with back in February, I guess it was. Wow. So how are things been for you?
Yes, it was an interesting time we met. The restaurant was pretty much vacant apart from a few of us in there, if I remember correctly. But anyway, look, that is life. We are actually still here. So far we have survived. Let's put it up.
Yeah, even in this kind of time, there's still lots to be thankful for. So the start of your career was you worked with a lot of recognizable brand names. You've always been in the kind of the logistics and distribution supply chain space, but you started your career more in the oil and gas side. So I'd love to hear how you made that transition into the healthcare space. You've been working now for about 6 or 7 years in that space. So I'd just love to hear a little bit about what that transition was like.
Look, I never ever thought that I'll be in the healthcare side. I kind of started in automotive. I ended up in sort of the distribution business. And then I ended up in the oil and gas with the business. And in oil and gas, it was a pretty much a sector which was very new to GE in those days. And think about this for a minute. 18 years ago, as part of the transformation, I actually developed and implemented. And when I say I, it's not me. It's really my team. A lot of the effort was really my team who actually helped me. But it was an Uber Freight we created. So just think about it. 18 years ago, we created an Uber Freight, which was very much had e-auctions, freight management, management of all freight, track and trace, which is available, which if you can just imagine a G well-established organization, deflation, cost out, sort of the performance is always at its peak every quarter. My job in that organization was really to kind of pioneer something where we could accelerate and bring some value to our sort of the customers and also for us internally. So that was where my kind of journey really started in oil and gas. And then from there on, I got moved into Asia, where I had a turnaround sort of the cap on, where I kind of segmented the manufacturing sites into very much a center of excellence. And I approached a lot of the customers in those days. And as you know, oil and gas is very much a state-owned customers, apart from the private sort of the sectors when you get into the US. But if you go into the Middle East and the rest of the world, it's very much a state-owned sort of organization.
Yeah.
So a lot of lobbying and a lot of explanation, and more importantly, credibility was really the key. And thereby kind of redesigning the manufacturing cells, creating centers of excellence, which actually gave faster output at higher sort of the quality, which kind of exceeded a lot of the customer expectations. So that was kind of the thing which I was doing in oil and gas. And then in healthcare, again in GE, they wanted to go through a similar sort of change, but it was more customer focused change and more about sort of the supply chain. And I must admit, it was a big sort of the question mark for me. Like, I'm not really a healthcare guy, and what does it mean? And when I joined, I was pleasantly surprised. One from an external point of view, and then one from an internal point of view. So let me explain the external. External, again, very much sort of the similar. Oil and gas is state-owned with a private sector and a nationalized sort of the sector, if I can say that. If we get into healthcare, it is pretty much the same. It's very much state-driven when it comes to healthcare, hospitals and GPs, etc. But then you got a private sector too. So from that point of view, it was very sort of the similar. If I look at the internal aspects, quality and safety was paramount in oil and gas. Safety in those days was very much about our people at the rigs, people handling those big, massive equipment. Whereas in healthcare, it's all about patient safety. So again, very similar sort of things across the sectors, but the shades of gray change clearly. Quality on the other side was very paramount in the oil and gas, making sure the product can, hundreds of meters below sea level, it's going to last there for at least 5 to 7 years before it goes through its first sort of the MOT as such. Right. So the quality processes, the quality sort of the management system, the engineering aspect was very kind of at the upper end in oil and gas. And when you look at the healthcare side, it's very sort of the similar, because here you are either inserting things into human beings, or you are giving them vaccines or something at sort of the temperature control. Again, quality is again sort of the paramount. So these were kind of the similarities. So it's more about the mindset change, but clearly going into healthcare is highly sort of the regulated. So is oil and gas industry. But obviously in healthcare, you've got to be more cautious. When it comes to change, it really digs into a lot of the risks, sort of the mitigation. So in healthcare, what I would say one of the key sort of the differences within oil and gas and healthcare is when you get into healthcare, it's more around managing risk and able to see risks around the corner. It's not on the day when it happens. That's too late.
Right, right. Well, thanks for sharing all that, Cam. It's there certainly are some interesting parallels and obviously differences between the sectors as well. So, sounds like you're enjoying the move into healthcare.
Yes, that's true. Okay, I've been enjoying it. Yeah.
Good. So, some of your more recent experience with Movianto is really interesting for a number of different reasons. Obviously, with the sale of Movianto from Owens and Minor to Walden in France. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Movianto business first. I think a lot of people will know who Owens and Minor is, but maybe less so about Movianto and how those two businesses interacted.
Sure. Okay, so if my memory serves me right, Owens and Minor bought Movianto back in 2012. They had gone out on a buying spree, Movianto, Halyard, Byron, and the others. And I think in those days, there was a big sort of the vision about Owens and Minor having a one-stop shop. Movianto was predominantly a 3PL involved in sort of the distribution, warehousing, and transportation. I mean, although we call it healthcare, but it's predominantly skewed towards the pharmaceutical side of the business.
Right.
It definitely did not do things like what Owens and Minor do. I mean, they actually buy and sell, they actually buy OEMs, sort of the supplies, and they own some of the supply chains into hospitals. I mean, that is clearly not Movianto. Movianto is very much a niche end, but mainly in sort of Europe. I mean, well established in Europe, although we operated across 89 sort of the countries. But I think the strategy was that eventually Movianto will get integrated into Owens and Minor. So it'll really become like a horizontal sort of the platform, right, which can support from a 3PL sort of the distribution for Byrons, Halyards, and the core sort of the distribution. Mm. And we had a new sort of the management just after I joined Movianto. And with the new sort of the management, I think there's a slightly change in sort of the direction where they wanted to focus more on the core side of the business. So it really operated as a standalone. So if the company decides to go back to its core, then obviously it was easy to kind of sell that off if you can, because it was very much a standalone sort of the platform.
So with the change in leadership at Owens and Minor, and like you alluded to, the Movianto business not kind of being fully integrated into Owens and Minor, and that made it perhaps more of a saleable piece of the business. But what kind of drove that sale, and maybe also you could tell us a little bit about your role within the sales process, if you like.
Sure. So being the business unit which is purely outside the US, whereas Amazon Minor is very much focused in the US as such. So that was one thing. And secondly, being a standalone, from what I understand, we've always had a lot of interested parties to buying Movianto too, if I go back a few years. This is before I actually joined.
Right.
So I think if I look at all of that, and obviously I don't know the boardroom sort of the discussions, but the instructions which I was given sometime middle of last year was that there's a slight change in course and Movianto is actually up for sale. And simply because it doesn't fit the core, it's not part of the core strategy. And obviously, if you read between the words, as you said, it's an easier to kind of sell at that level. And plus, it was really autonomous, and it was away from the US too. I mean, that was maybe partly my sort of the perception, but that's how it was. So my role was really to work with our M&A team back in the US in our HQ to work out. So what we did was really went through a list of interested parties in the past. I think that's what you normally start off with. And we went through it, and we came across EHDH Group, which is now being renamed as the Walden Group, actually, on the day of the acquisition, the day we closed the acquisition. And they were very keen, and we started to explore with them a bit more in terms of their interest and our interests. And what I learned a few things was Mr. Baldry himself. He did his apprenticeship in the Movianto sites many years ago.
Okay.
So that was one thing. And secondly, as far as I was concerned, my role was I closed the transaction and we found a buyer who really valued Movianto, and Movianto was going to grow. So we are not into this realignment, etc., etc. And for me, EHDH, or shall I call it the Walden Group, was actually a nice fit. A family-run sort of the business who got huge aspirations to grow. And then on the other side, we got Movianto, which had done extremely well actually in the last few years in terms of its growth, profitability, and the processes we had put in place. It was a nice mix in terms of I could see that it was not a step sort of the backwards for Movianto. It is going to be a step sort of the forward because he was very much passionate about the business. Plus, he had served his apprenticeship there. So there was a lot of energy. There was a lot of energy where I could also see that a lot of our employees in Movianto could actually get a great sort of the future going in because they could actually teach the other side, and the other side, I'm sure there was a lot to teach from the transportation side of the business because they really predominantly came in from the transportation stream, whereas Movianto had a mix of two streams. One was the warehousing and one was the transportation stream. And we actually closed the deal actually just over Christmas in 2019. So that was definitely before COVID. And my challenge there was, how do we manage COVID? How do we manage the sell process, and how do I, with my team, still meet our expectations, both in terms of our customer expectations and both in terms of the financial and the shareholder expectations. Yeah. And I'm very proud to say that the day we closed it, which is on the 18th of June, we had actually exceeded our expectations at all fronts. So that is one thing I'm very pleased for my team, which I left sort of there in Movianto, and I'm sure they're going to do extremely well. Yeah. And that for me was a big prize, sort of the winner in all these crises you still met all the obligations.
What a unique experience and unique time to kind of go through not only a sale, but just being in the kind of business that you were in. So, what did you, out of curiosity, what would you say you learned through the uniqueness of that experience that you might be able to apply going forward in whatever you do next?
So the first thing is, I hope that COVID type pandemic never happens again, because I really. So that was a good sort of the learning, but I would say that we should never have that again. But going through that is painful enough. Painful being, you got to be planful, you got to engage everyone, you got to overly communicate everything, and safety is sort of the paramount. But the things which I really learned in the sale process was, how do you keep the team focused? I think that was probably one of our biggest sort of the focus area, because you got COVID going on, you got people who are very concerned about their families, about their peers, their colleagues at work. And then at the same time, there's a question mark about their sort of the future. As you know, when there's an acquisition happening or a sale happening, there's always a risk of job losses, whether we say it or not. That's sort of the human, sort of the nature. And whilst all of that is going on, how do you keep the teams focused where the customer does not see any impact? I mean, that is the paramount. So my learning was really about making sure that we still marched everyone in the same sort of the direction, same focus, give them all the support. Yeah. And these are the times when you really demonstrate to your employees that we are here, there to support you. And that is my key sort of the mantra, always has been, is I'm not here for you to support me, I'm here to support you, right? So we actually unlocked a lot of things. We mobilized a lot of stuff. For example, the PPE, I never went through any middlemen or traders or things like that. We went straight to the suppliers who we had either known in the past, or we know who had the capability to supply us the PPE. I was a bit sort of the fortunate, because although I was based in the UK, we started to see the the COVID impact earlier in Italy and in other sort of the places. So we started to mobilize a lot of the stuff very fast. Right. So that was one thing. And then the other thing which I learned was, keep the buyer up to date. This is the time when you keep the buyer informed. So every week, we had a call, we had an update to the buyers through the M&A group, obviously. Yeah. Making sure that they were absolutely fully informed what we're doing. And on many occasions, the buyer would speak to me and say, is there any help I can give you or anything? So in this thing, especially when you're in a sale process, particularly when you announce it in the stock market, which we had to, yeah. Over communication is important, both to the buyer and both to your people as well. I had a weekly call with my team every week on a Friday to give them exactly a pulse status of where we were in the sale and acquisition of this.
Okay, good. So, and in terms of the actual kind of demands on the Movianto infrastructure, let's say the systems, you've talked a little bit about the people, but your ability to deliver at a higher volume, presumably than you had been before. It's one thing to sign the contract with the NHS, but then you have to turn around and deliver it. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of those unique challenges that were presented by COVID.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a very good question, Gordon. So look, at the start of this year, we obviously had won the pandemic stuff with NHS. That was around March time. And that was a massive program in itself. And then coupled with that, as you know, from several wins we had the year before, we had those sort of the go lives too. So we were at a situation where COVID had just gone live in terms of trying to work from home, etc. So we had to, that was in itself a constraint on us, because majority of like our customer service people and some of the other operational people really have the desktops, really. I mean, they don't really have the laptops. So we had to urgently chase sort of the laptops around the world because that sort of, the commodity became very precious overnight. So we had to ship a lot of it in quickly. And the IT guys, I tell you, we have a very good IT team in Movianto, and they turned it all around. And we made sure that individuals who could work with the desktop at home, they could work on that. Guys who had laptops, we gave them new laptops, so they were being sort of demobilized. So that was one aspect of it. The biggest sort of the constraint we really had was customers where we had to go live. So now we had to do things sort of the remotely. So one, it was about being sort of managing sort of the remotely, and then secondly, we weren't really sure about the impact we're going to have with COVID. Like we could have a large sort of the population who could be affected or something. So what we did was, as part of the go live, we overly sort of resourced a lot. So we overly resourced our warehousing people, the drivers. And the good news was we were in a lucky spot, maybe. Don't take me wrong, but there were other big 3PLs where they had shut down a lot of their lanes where there were drivers available from those lanes, and there were warehousing employees or kind of supermarket employees or whatever who were available. So we kind of quickly went on a hiring campaign, and we overly sort of resourced everything. There were customers, they were very happy what we had done in terms of the labor campaign, the hiring campaign we had done, the systems. We had gone into laptops immediately, although we paid a bit of over the odds, I think, in my opinion, but I could be wrong. But my IT guys tell me that it was a fair price. And a lot of sort of the VPNs, etc., which was a lot of the auxiliary stuff we had to sort of unlock. Clearly, we have dedicated teams in project teams and dedicated trainers for the new implementations, and they did a marvelous job. Where we kind of, our go live was on plan, and our go live went defect free. So that was really some of the things we had to do. Was more around risk, more around looking around the corner, which is around the labor, especially making sure that we had the people just in case if the infection was high. And things like that. And the IT guys, I must admit, they were really at the forefront. And overall, what I will say is Movianto employees in itself, my team itself, they really viewed it as it's going to be my cousin, my family, my friend, or someone in the supply chain, in the hospital or in GP who could be impacted. So the role which I'm doing is very critical. And that in itself added a lot of sort of the enthusiasm amongst my teams to make things happen. So really kudos to all of them.
Yeah, well, what an experience, and it's kind of a shame sometimes to think that it's the crisis that brings people together. But I think as long as you take those learnings and apply them going forward, and try and keep that motivation, and then at least you've put yourself a little bit more ahead of where you were previously. So that's really
true. True. Like in the COVID, sort of, we had a crisis call every day, for example, right? And everyone was so engaged. Everyone was doing things up and beyond what I was expecting them to do. So ownership, accountability, and empowerment was all there.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing all that you have, Cam. It's certainly an interesting history that you've had there, both with Movianto and your earlier career. So, obviously things with the sale of Movianto have changed for your personal circumstances. But so I'd love to hear a little bit about what you want to do in the future. What's next? What's next and going to be interesting for you?
Sure. I've lived and worked in the US, in Europe, Italy, and Belgium, UK, of course, in Asia. I've been in Singapore. So I've been around the world, lived and worked. And what I've really enjoyed is transformation and really bringing the value to our sort of the customers and such. Even for example, when I was in DHL or SIVA, even in sort of the Movianto, my mantra has always been around is pick, pack, and ship. Anyone can do. Let's be honest for a minute. It's more around the value adds which actually go around it: analytics, track and trace, a lot of the analytics where the customers really, really, where you can really give them that value where they can really do with, right? And that is where I'll spend a lot of my time, even in oil and gas industry. I mean, it was more around transformation, more around how can we bring this customer more closer to your sort of things of the products and services we sell. If I look at some of the websites, typically even now, it's like that's the product, this is the product feature. Do you want to buy it? Great, fingers up. That to me is not value added. There's a lot more. I mean, there's a lot more. You've got to be more intimate with our customers. Bring a lot of the supply chain, a lot of the things which you can add sort of the value with them, and that's the sort of stuff where I'm really focused on. And the challenge I'm looking for is really like a P&L role, but more where you can take the corporate or company's products or their sort of the services, and how can you upgrade that further, where you are penetrating further into our customers, sort of the supply chain itself, and ultimately to patients. One of the key areas, I mean, I've enjoyed it being in healthcare, and I hope I stay within that sort of the sector. Uh, Simply because it's very close to my heart. You kind of, it's all about patients, and let's be honest, your friends, yourself, your family. We visit hospitals and GPs and pharmacies, and some of the frustrations we see and some of the things we see is something where I want to do where we can really improve that, for example. Yeah. So that is the area I want to stay in. So P&L role, continue with the transformation and change. And that's what I've been used to. That's what excites me.
Yeah.
And more importantly, adding the value, really. I mean, that's what it is, really.